Hey, seventh graders. So today, hopefully, you guys got those four bacteria articles in over how bacteria grows, how bacteria pretty much is considered the first living organism on Earth. You know, how they help make food, like especially dairy products, and just some of those. What was the other one? Those the trivia kind of articles. Hopefully, you guys got those done in the last class and you answered some of those questions. All right, so today on Thursday, 10/22/2020. So I have this bacteria articles and prokaryote coloring sheet is due today. And then we went right into are wimpy handshakes good? And so you guys should have or should read this article right here. Is there an upside to a wimpy handshake? And it goes on to talk about weak handshakes. So we all know that we've learned if whether your grandpa or somebody has taught you how to shake a hand properly, get in there nice and deep and get your whole hand. Well, anyways, this talks about how using something like a fist bump or maybe a high five, something that's fast and you don't touch as much as somebody else's hand, transmits fewer bacteria is the big idea of this. And so what these guys did in this experiment, and so you still need to read this whole experiment, okay? But anyways, essentially what they did is they took two gloves. They had a clean, sterile glove, and then they took a nasty glove that they dipped in bacteria, and then they shook somebody else's hand with that. And they took that now infected, it used to be clean glove, that now infected one, and they grew bacteria with it. And then they did a fist bump, so they had the dirty one, and then they had a sterile glove. They fist bumped, then took that sterile one that's now dirty, and they grew bacteria with it, and then they did a high five one, and they looked at how much bacteria came from those three different kinds of handshakes, and they talk about it in this article, okay? And so when you go to read this and you're like, well, how do they measure microbial growth, or how do they measure how much bacteria is transmitted from the dirty glove, that already has all of this? It says Escherichia coli here. Okay, that's actually E. coli. That's why we just call it E. coli, because Escherichia is kind of hard to pronounce for a lot of people. But anyways, how they do that is I put a video link here on my plan book page. It's right here after you get done reading it, how they measure microbial growth. Watch it. And it starts talking about how these guys measure microbial growth. They set up a petri dish. The stuff you already know. You need to know, you guys. They start swapping so anyways, that's what we started off doing, and there are these two questions that you guys need to go ahead and write these down, and you're going to attach these to this worksheet, okay, the prokaryote versus eukaryote worksheet that I put on Teams that needs to be turned in. So then we went on to notes on the cell theory, prokaryote versus eukaryotes. All right, so that's located down here. Like I said, all of this stuff is located on Teams. So what we then did, we started talking about the cell theory. And so it starts back in 1665 with this guy named Robert Hooke, who made his own microscope and started finding his own cells and stuff like that. And so it starts out by talking about what's spontaneous generation. Does life come from nothing? So like I said, I'm just going to kind of walk through this. You guys need to go ahead and fill out the notes for this, but I'm just going to kind of give you a short synopsis of these notes. People used to think, like I said, about 65 or even up to the Civil War and before that, people thought of this idea of spontaneous generation, this idea that organisms came from non-living things. This is wrong, obviously. We know worms don't fall from the sky when it rains, right? When you go out and walk outside and you look on the pavement and stuff like that, you see worms everywhere. Well, worms, the ground's saturated with water and the worms need to come to the surface to breathe. But we know that now, but people used to think that they just fell out of the sky. They think that flies came from rotting food, or they came from the mud, or they came from trash. Well, we just know that flies lay their eggs in rotting food and trash, and then maggots are their larval stage, and then those maggots then turn into flies later on. They didn't know that back then. So that's what got them thinking that. All right, and then that's just plain and simple. A couple different scientists you guys start to learn about. So this Robert Hooke discovered the first cells from quarks. And here's a picture of his first microscope here. It's pretty simple. Then we have this Anton van Leeuwenhoek 8 years later who discovered some other unicellular organisms in ponds and found out that animals now, as well as plants, both are made up of cells. Uh, and then there's this Francesco Redi experiment. So this is actually a hyperlink right here. So you can click on that, and it will take you to an experiment that shows you meat. And so they leave meat out where flies can get it to it, and then they take another one where air can kind of get into it, but no flies or anything can. And so the one where that's completely open, like you see down here, flies were able to lay their maggots in, and then flies came from this, where they had a cloth over the other one, and nothing was able to touch it, and it just rotted, and no maggots came from it. Then you talk about this Anthony Virchow, or sorry, Anthony, I don't know where we got that. Rudolf Virchow, this German physician, and a physician's just a medical doctor, and he studied cells, how they grew, how they operate essentially. And he said that cells must derive from pre-existing cells. And so this is something I think that we know that's pretty simple to get along with, but it's just as simple as, where did you come from? Well, you came from your parents. Where did your parents come from? They came from their parents. Where did their parents come from? They came from their parents, right? And we know this to be true. But a lot of people were thinking just because they were cells, that these cells or these flies or worms may have came from nothing. They may have came from mud, and that's just not true. Other worms come from other worms. Flies come from other flies. Cells come from other cells. Okay? They do not come from nowhere. Where does life come from? So there's this Louis Pasteur. And so you guys may be familiar with this process called pasteurization, right? Pasteurized milk. And so we know that milk, when it comes from a cow, it still has some bacteria from the cow that gives it its taste. And it's not necessarily bad, but there can be harmful bacteria, especially if you leave it in milk for long enough and let that bacteria grow and grow and grow, and then that milk will spoil. So we kill it right away. And so this pasteurization is where we boil it, we kill off all the microbes, and then we cool it down real fast. And then we get our milk. Okay? And so Louis Pasteur in the mid-1800s proved biogenesis. And biogenesis is what we believe to be true today, is all living things only arise from pre-existing organisms, which is blah, no duh, right? So he took two flasks here. He took this flask that was closed off to the outside environment, he boiled it and left it for a while, and there was no microbial growth. Number two, he boiled this broth, so like chicken broth or beef broth. He boiled it, he broke the top off so air could get into it, and he found that microbial growth happens. So then we find out that these microorganisms are everywhere. They live in the air. They're floating around in the air. I'm breathing in and out microbial air, microbes that are in the air right now. And so now we obviously know that not all microbes are bad, right? And we've taught, and you should have learned that from your bacteria in the cafeteria little thing that you did after your quiz. So most bacteria is actually not harmful. Some of it's helpful, some of it's harmful. And so then it goes on to, here's our three basic components to the cell theory, right? And you guys know a lot of this. Like I said, make sure you guys are filling this out. Then this should look very familiar to you. You guys have already done this with the organelles, so skip ahead here. Then we have our difference. What's the difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells? We've talked about this a little bit. We know that there are two different types of life. We have eukaryotic, which we are. They're complex. They have nuclei, they have mitochondria, chloroplast, Golgi apparatus. They're very complex. They have these membrane-bound organelles. Where here, in this little picture, this is our prokaryote, where it has a nucleoid. It says nucleoid. That just means there's this region where the DNA is stored. It has cytoplasm. They have ribosomes. Ribosomes are just really, they're organelles, but they're large molecules. They're not even membrane-bound. All cells need ribosomes because all cells need proteins to be made. Okay, so membrane-bound organelles. These are eukaryotic cells, and this picture right here is of prokaryotic cells, such as bacteria are examples of prokaryotes. We have our eukaryotic cells. Cells contain organelles which can be held together by a membrane. So plants, animals, these guys are eukaryotic. There can be unicellular eukaryotic cells, but all prokaryotic cells, like bacteria and other things, they are only unicellular. Okay, and then we have our similarities. So it says plasma membrane. That's the same thing as the cell membrane. The cytosol here is the same thing as the cytoplasm. Chromosomes. These are just structures in which the DNA clumps up into. Okay, so chromosomes. You get chromosomes, or you get your DNA, half from your mom, half from your dad. They come together, and then they make up you, a completely unique individual. All cells have tiny ribosomes that make proteins. We just talked about that. Differences, boom, right here. And make sure you know that eukaryotic cells, they're more complex, they're bigger. Prokaryotic cells, they're smaller, they're very simple. Okay, and you should have gotten that from your prokaryotic worksheet. Okay, you need to keep all this stuff. So please get this done and get this turned in. And on your fill-in notes that you're filling in right now, make sure you go ahead and attach those 2 questions that came from your Wimpy Handshake article right up here. 1 and 2. These guys need to be attached to that after you get done reading your Wimpy Handshake article. And then it says read articles on immune system. We did not get to this today. I didn't think we would. We had a couple minutes left at the end of class, but we didn't have enough to even start on this. So we will go ahead and start on the immune system article on Monday. All right, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions at all.